Peter Hitchens. Welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
So far, so good.
Yes, we've had some tech issues, but that's fine. I would much rather speak to you in an audio version than not at all. It's a real pleasure to welcome you onto the show. You're one of Britain's most renowned journalists after decades of writing about making cases, I suppose, for a reasoned, impassioned defence of tradition and what you think we've lost as a nation in Britain, and also doing a pretty good job of skewering popular trains of thought as they hit the mainstream and predicting their inevitable failure. And I suppose looking back on your body of work, you appear to possess a prophetic-like quality, and I think that it's fair to say, hasn't exactly won you many friends over the years, but I don't suspect that you care about that. You seem to...
Well, I do care about it. It's the curse of Cassandra, always to be right, never to be believed. It's immensely frustrating. And the thing is that nobody learns anything from it. I get derided, and then I turn out to be right, and then there's another controversy in which I'm again derided and again turn out to be right. And nobody learns anything from the previous occasion that it might just be worthwhile listening to me the first time round. Generally, anything I say which is derided will become current between 3 and 10 years after I first said it. And just as things that I do become fashionable, riding bicycles, which when I began doing it in London in the 1970s was a ludicrous activity regarded as one step short of the actual mental hospital, is now immensely fashionable, but it certainly wasn't then. I can think of some others, but I'll leave you with that for the moment.
Well, Peter, I'm sure we'll get perhaps some of your next prophecies throughout the course of the conversation. Yeah. However, I think it would be good to stick in your body of work, which is focused a lot on Britain, its sense of decline, and the pace of cultural change. And let's begin with something topical. I read a Spectator article just today by Patrick West, who was commenting on the recent British Social Attitude Survey. So he said, according to the British Social Attitude Survey 2023, just 64% of the public said they were proud or very proud of Britain's history, down from 86% in 2013, and the lowest this has been since the question was first asked in 1995. So some commentators, Peter, say that we're living in a war on the past. And I suppose unconnected with the survey, I've heard David Starkey recently say that this isn't so much the death of England, but the attempted murder. Do you agree that there has been a war in the past and this might be contributing to a lack of faith in the country?
Oh, I don't doubt it. In my first book, which is now a quarter of a century old, The Abolition of Britain, I devoted part of the book to an examination of the way in which history teaching had changed, and that the whole attitude towards our past, which had previously been common, normal, university taught, had been abandoned and replaced with one which was much more critical. And I'm not actually against being critical of the past. Many things happened in the past which were very bad, and some of the things that we're taught about the past probably need to be revised. I think it's a basic... What is jeered at as drum and trumpet history has its faults. So I'm not completely against people saying let's teach it in some ways differently and reflect on some of the things in the past that we previously not mentioned. The problem is it hasn't been done for that reason. It hasn't been done to give people a fuller, a richer and more balanced picture of the past. It's been used to try to validate the present by making the past look worse than it was. And this is always the technique of revolutionary governments, revolutionary states, revolutionary movements. It's actually at the heart of George Orwell's 1984, the obliteration of any true information about the past, which makes it possible for the ruling party to suggest to everybody that the world they live in, horrible as it is far, far better than it was under the old regime. And I think that has been happening. I'm almost surprised at the figures that 64% still do feel a pride in the British past after the belaboring that this idea has been receiving in schools and universities and indeed on the BBC for so long. But I think it's plain that they have succeeded to some extent particularly among those who are too young to have had any other experience. And the other thing, of course, which was accelerated since I wrote my book, that it had certainly begun when I did so, is the disintegration of the old-fashioned tight-knit family, in which the law of the past was carried from one generation to another, and the schools didn't play so much of a part in it, and media didn't play so much of a part in it, and social media didn't play so much of a part in it. So things that I grew up believing, thinking I knew, whether they were literary or historical or cultural, were passed on to me by my parents and my uncles and my aunts and my grandfather. Nowadays, I think an awful lot of children simply don't have that source. All they get is the public sources, and all the public sources are devoted to suggesting that the past was a time of cruelty, scarcity, misery, abuse of various kinds, and oppression. And it's not surprising that they come to believe that. But the real reason for all these attacks on the past is undoubtedly to make people more content with the very unsatisfactory present.
How did that change occur? So it sounds to me as though you're describing a world in which both a governing class and even people in the everyday had this concept of stewardship, where they weren't the owners of something, they felt they had to pass something on, they had to keep it going. And yet we've now moved into a world of, I suppose, to use corporate speak, change makers. Everyone wants to be revolutionary in some way. And
Yes.
we tend to live in the present and don't really have a link to the past or think about ancestral stuff. It sounds like you felt that change begin to occur. What was behind that?
When I first looked into it, I thought, well, maybe there is some, because I myself, as a former Marxist-Leninist, would tend to assume that some things which looked as if they were they had just occurred naturally might conceivably have been achieved by action, by propagandists. And I've no doubt that in some professions and in some areas of the media, there have been groups of people working with purpose to try and change this, quite in some cases quite openly. I think there were societies among teachers, for instance, who wanted to change the teaching of history and change the teaching of English, and succeeded in doing so. But such groups of people have existed, I should think, probably for at least a century and probably longer in this country. The thing is that during the 1960s, particularly, and afterwards, they became much more successful than they'd been before. I think this was because that was the point at which the old authorities, the authorities in religion, authorities in knowledge, authorities in morals, whatever they might be, had all begun to disintegrate. And particularly they disintegrated because what you might call Christendom had been dealt a completely fatal blow during the 1914-18 war. And that really began to have its most profound effects in the 1960s, as the last generation of those who'd been brought up before the change began to disappear and a new generation came into being. Fascinating to remember, I'm so old. In 1964, the BBC made a tremendous series on the First World War, a television series, one of the best things it's ever done. And one of the most gripping things about it was the number of people they were able to interview who were still, although old, were still healthy and compos mentis enough to give direct eyewitness personal accounts of the years before and during the First World War. And those people were still around. And in the years afterwards, they disappeared quite rapidly, as such people do, as they grew old and died, and ceased to be influential in society. So I think that shows you that the general moral and educational catastrophe caused by the First World War finally began to have its deepest effects in the 1960s and afterwards, which is also the era when the British education system was more or less destroyed by the destruction of the state grammar schools and the vast expansion of the universities, which hasn't stopped since. And also the time, of course, when television became a very conformist force and largely under the control of people with Bloomsbury ideas and Bloomsbury morals from then on, began to become a really dominant force, even more so when colour television was introduced later in the decade.
The confidence, I suppose in Christendom, I find it remarkable actually that it was those ideals ultimately that drove those men to war. So I was reading Robert Toombs' The English and Their History recently, and I think I keep on bringing this up in podcasts, but it's such a great book. And he talks about how history started to twist how the men of that time were viewed, and that they were thrown to slaughter by people, but actually many felt throughout the country that they were genuinely fighting against something bad, and that it was their duty to do so.
Well, there you have me, because I have no doubt at all that they were hurled into a futile slaughter for no good reason at all. And I think that until this recognition becomes general, most people will still not be able to look back on modern history with a clear eye. But I tried and tried. I have to tell you, I tried to believe that Earl Haig and Lloyd George were actually men of goodwill and conscience who were fighting for a good cause. But I'm afraid it simply doesn't stand up to examination. The thing was a catastrophe and a grave mistake and a national disaster. And the thing was that all the great moral, educational and social forces of the country lined up behind it. So that the churches and the universities and everybody else said, yes, we must fight this war. And anybody who voiced any doubts about it was driven into corners and presented with white feathers and called a coward. And it was total, and it led to a revolution in our society as well, because as a result of this, the government, previously a very minor force in most people's lives, became immensely powerful. And the old A.J.P. Taylor statement that before the First World War, the only contact the average Englishman had with the state was the occasional view of a policeman walking down the street and the postman delivering his letters in the morning. Apart from that, the state wasn't there. After the First World War, it was present in everything, regulating and observing and recording and intervening. And Paul Cambon, who was French ambassador in London throughout the First World War and before and after it, said, I think in 1920, that he believed that Britain had undergone a revolution during the First World War as profound as the one that France underwent in the years after 1789. I think he was right. I think it was enormous, but because it's not called the British Revolution, people don't realize, but it's a complete chasm, an almost visible chasm if you look at at architecture, literature, newspapers, plays, all the other things which could take the temperature of the society, and even the way people dress before 1914 and after 1918. They're two different countries. But the most profound change, the moral change, took a bit longer to have its full effect. But I believe that was it. And it wasn't a group of people, as Gramscian cultural revolutionaries, working to change the country. There no doubt there were such people, but it was a failure. It was a collapse of the old, and in the collapse of the old was a vacuum. And there were other things which happened during my own childhood, particularly memorable, the Suez Crisis and the Profumo affair, in which the ruling orders of this country looked both ludicrous and foolish and inept, and lost their authority, and that authority extended down. So after Anthony Eden had bungled Suez, and after the cabinet had been made to look a laughing stock over the Profumo affair, everybody from the vicar to the policeman to the teacher in your school to your parents lost significant authority. And so all kinds of other ideas could then rush in to the vacuum left by this failing authority, and they did.
So this loss of faith brought about not necessarily even just in the Christian God and everything our society was cohered around through the institutions, but all of the institutions themselves.
Yes.
Is there anything that can save that? Because the crisis of confidence.
Well, are you asking me to engage in political and social activism? No. I am an observer. I don't. When you see, as I feel I have done through the work that I've done over the past 25 years writing about this, when you see the extent and depth and height and breadth of this thing, the idea that any individual or any group of individuals working to try and prevent it could have any effect on it is comical. It's gigantic. It's like a tsunami. and a child standing on a beach with a sandcastle is more what anybody who tries to oppose it is like. You will be overwhelmed. It's enormous. One of the problems with it is that people like it. It has liberated people from an awful lot of restraints, which when they'd cast them off, they decided they had never had any point in the first place and they were unwelcome. And there's this extraordinary thing. If you switch off an electric device, then it stops working instantly. If you engage in a moral revolution, then there is a long, long period of afterglow during which things continue as they were before, or appear to do, though they're gradually fading. And by the time you realize that you have lost something forever, it's far too late to go back on the actions which caused it to disappear. You can destroy a taboo or custom which has been in existence for centuries in an afternoon, but you cannot then replace it again. You can't say, well, that was a mistake, we must put it back. Once it's gone, it's gone. And people, as I say, the great banner of the new age is not atheism, it's not Marxism-Leninism, it's what I call selfism. It's what its own supporters call personal autonomy, the freedom to do as you wish, which doesn't have any, for most people, it doesn't have any philosophical or political basis. It's just, why can't I do what I like with my own body, put whatever drugs into it I wish, have whatever relations with other people I wish to have? That's let's just order everything on the basis of the harm principle and let me decide what I do that is harmful and what I do that isn't harmful, and nobody else. And that is the society we've created. And in such societies, more or less selfless attitudes such as serious patriotism, not to mention Christianity, are unsustainable. People are they're not even interested in them anymore.
So would you subscribe to, and I don't know when he said this, the Churchill quotation when he said, "Nothing can save England if she will not save herself. If we lose faith in ourselves, in our capacity to guide and govern, if we lose our will to live, then indeed our story is told."
It's a political statement. And Churchill, I don't think Churchill was a Christian believer. There's no evidence that he was. It's a political statement about rallying people to a temporal cause. When he was in office, certainly to begin with, the country was in mortal danger, and therefore he had a very strong loudspeaker through which to communicate with the nation. So if either you listen to me, or we're done for. That's not the case now, is it? And there is from peril comes power. And we're not in the sort of peril which would enable anyone to accumulate or draw to themselves the sort of power which Churchill got, even to influence people's minds. So no, it's not to be mistaken for a political problem. The political problems were long ago, and most of the time they were going on, people didn't have any idea that they were going on or what they meant, as they generally don't. The world goes on around most people, especially those who have no Marxist-Leninist training. It just goes on around them, and they have no idea what's happening. And by the time they find out what has happened, it's far too late to do anything about it.
Well, you've touched a lot, and you've written a lot about England, Britain, the hard-won liberty on these isles, the country's cultural achievements and legacy, and their subsequent loss. What was the high watermark of the country's culture, and what are its lows, and why ought we lament it?
Oh, that's nostalgia, which I don't express. There are many highs and many lows. It doesn't come in a sort of incremental, slowly constructed way. There have been a number of things which have gone well, and a number of things which have then gone badly. So that the development of those laws protecting the freedom of speech, for instance, is quite shaky in law, and has almost entirely collapsed in recent years under various assaults. Both the speech codes of the new of the new dominant class, which are hostile to free speech, and the willingness of governments to classify certain opinions as extremist or far this or far that, which makes them harder to express. So things which technically still exist don't operate. One of our greatest documents of actual liberty and limited government, the Bill of Rights, is so forgotten that we recently had a prime minister who didn't know it existed, and it doesn't operate if it prevents governments, for instance, from punishing people without trying them. But our governments do this all the time. And the Bill of Rights is, you can shout about it if you like, but nobody will pay any attention. The courts have pretty much decided it doesn't apply anymore. But technically, it's still a sort of entrenched statute written on vellum and stored away in the archives. But it doesn't apply because we simply haven't, as a people, got the spirit anymore to defend it. So things can still be in the letter of the law, which don't operate because of the spirit. So up and down it goes, and there's been no particular sort of paradise time when it was better than at any other, nor peak. Life isn't like that. There are a number of moments at which things have gone particularly well for liberty, as they did during the glorious revolution of 1688. And other times when they went very badly subsequent to that, the awful repressions of the Napoleonic era governments, which were after that. So no, I don't clutch at some ideal point when things were at their best, because it never existed. It never will. This is human society. It's again, if you read through the Old Testament, the constant downfall of the children of Israel as they turn away yet again from what they've been told to do by the Almighty. They just they say yes, we'll do it, and everything's fine, and then they stop doing it, and before they know where they are, they're being carted off to Babylon again.
It strikes me of a Tolkien-esque quality to what you're saying, this idea of history being a long defeat, and there are just flashes of victory along the way, but otherwise it trends.
I don't think it's none of those things. It does contain lessons. You can tell very easily when what you're doing is going to have bad results, but getting people to learn those lessons and act upon them is more or less possible. If it doesn't suit people to learn lessons, then they don't learn them.
And this is because, or at least partly contributed to, or maybe wholly contributed to, by this moral revolution you talked about taking place with the wish for personal autonomy above all else. You know, you're not going to make me do anything that's going to feel like a sacrifice. It's
a perfectly reasonable wish, isn't it? But the thing is, you draw it up for yourself. And then you might become shocked later on when somebody else who believes the same thing, who's stronger than you, tells you that, as it happens, the harm principle doesn't prevent them from doing something terrible to you. And this is the problem with it. I've always said, if you want to be an atheist, it's very handy to be rich, and to live in nice, secluded areas where most people probably aren't atheists. People who are atheists don't want all the many people who work for them to steal from them, for instance. But if the whole world became atheists, which may not be far off in this country, then why shouldn't they steal from them? There's no fundamental reason why they shouldn't do. There is the morality without religion has no absolute basis at all. You can concoct whatever morality you like for yourself.
Yes, well, that seems quite clear that there's quite a lot of those elements going on in the modern culture, as well as people who refuse to admit that even the things that they care about most, like tolerance and compassion and all of those other Christian-aligned ideals which were institutionalized and embedded throughout the cultures, that's where they came from. People like to say, no, they came from the Enlightenment time, that's the Big Bang, if they even know that far back at all. The bits, the points you were making around the speech codes in which we've seen develop in recent years over Britain, And we have seen, since the Labour Party's come to power, an increasingly progressive authoritarian governance actually take hold. And when you look around,
would you call it that? I don't think I recognise that.
Okay, what would you call it? What would you say that has been going on? Maybe it's a misnomer.
And I have to keep referring to these things because these were major efforts of research and thought on my part, and I treasure them. I wrote a book called The Abolition of Liberty, now again 21 years ago, in which I said that a society in which in which we were relativistic about crime and other misbehavior would become a society in which we had to be less free. You can't operate the proper presumption of innocence. You can't operate a police force which is a people's police force rather than a state police in a society with so much disorder that people become ready to accept a much stronger state, much heavier-handed policing methods than they previously were. I said this was happening and would continue to happen, and nobody paid the slightest attention. And one of the very few absolute pleasures I have in life is saying that I told you so. And on this occasion, I can absolutely say I predicted this, and it has happened. As we have become more disorderly, if we refuse to accept that crime is the fruit of wickedness and greed, and continue to make excuses for it, and constructed a criminal justice and police system on the basis that crime is a response to bad social conditions, we have created a society which is of necessity less free because it has had to become more heavy-handed. The Blair government is a particular example of this, but authoritarian, I'm not sure. We're not exactly talking Augusto Pinochet here, are we?
Well, true.
I think you have to be very careful. There's quite enough inflation in the world without sensible, informed people indulging in language inflation. And things can be bad without necessarily being the worst. And you can have a society which is more narrow and more unpleasantly governed than the one you had before without it being the same as Vladimir Putin's Russia.
Well, I suppose we talked a little bit about your prophetic qualities earlier, and looking at the trajectory then, Peter, if we're not at that authoritarian state, what does the trajectory look like based on how you've seen the many moves that's led us here, where liberties have eroded and we are less free in many ways, whether it's through expression or even just in our ability to walk through the world because of everything we've talked about, whether it's the relativism or the changing in policing. Where are we headed on current trajectory? What kind of a society?
Nothing good, but the thing is that I think Lenin said that sometimes nothing can happen for years, and on other occasions, decades can happen in weeks. And two things are profoundly influential in changing society. One is war, and the other is economic catastrophe. I think this country is in a state of very severe economic instability. Our current account state, our general indebtedness, both public and private, is colossal and worrying. Our ability to regenerate any kind of industrial base looks to me to be pretty much finished. We have one of the worst education systems in the advanced world. We have a growing amount of crime and disorder and incompetent government and waste on an extraordinary scale. I can't see how this can end well, but it would just carry on, gradually getting more and more ragged at the edges. We all have the experience. You can't get anything to happen, can you? Nothing works properly. Trying to contact anybody for help with anything is extraordinarily difficult. The price of everything, partly thanks to the COVID panic, is now sometimes almost unbelievably high compared with what it was only 4 or 5 years ago. All these things impinge on our lives, and many of us know that our children's education is extremely substandard, and yet they have to pay an enormous amount to go to universities which are not particularly good. Transport, housing, you name it. It's becoming beyond the reach of so many people, and the savings which people have accumulated to protect themselves against the worst are being eroded. So all these things push towards severe political trouble, and the extraordinary desire of our government, which is astoundingly to me actually popular with many people, to find someone to go to war with and to fight it, even though we don't really have any armed forces to speak of left, is equally risky. I mean, it is perfectly possible that we could, within the next 5 years, be sucked into an actual land war in Europe. And the effects of that, who knows what they could be? How long would it go on for? Well, how badly would it affect us? So many things are working towards a decay and disruption and destabilization and worse, that I can't be optimistic about it. But on the other hand, to make a detailed prediction and say within 3 years such and such will happen, I'm not going to do that because I don't know. Anybody could make general predictions of the future, actually. It's not at all difficult. The difficulty is in getting the time scale right. And I can't tell you when these things will get really so bad that they will look like a crisis even to the stupid. But I think that the crisis is definitely coming.
Yes, and you touched on a point which others have tried to make, which is, and this is with you saying, trying to do anything to turn this around is futile. You know, you effectively the only way out is through.
I'd be happy to be proved wrong about that. If anybody can do so, then I'll be pleased. But I can't, looking at what I see any reason to believe that it will happen.
Okay. Well, let's do a bit of a gear shift to things that have hit the news recently. I suppose we've seen riots in Britain. Some have said this.
No, there haven't been riots.
Okay.
There've been outbreaks of disorder, but riots are a completely different thing. And I think it's been quite... it's an interesting thing which happens when somebody has a political agenda which they wish to pursue, and there is some sort of disorder in the streets, then there's a great tendency on their part to call it a riot so that they can use it as a weapon to get what they wanted in the first place. And one of the major episodes of this in recent history was the so-called Brixton riots of, I think, 81 or 82, followed by the Scarman Report, an astounding document which I analyze in the Abolition Bluesy. Basically, what were some very fishy disorders in parts of South London were used by those who wanted to revolutionize the police force to do so. And characterizing that, and there was some outbreaks in Liverpool as well, in Toxteth, and I think in Handsworth in Birmingham, characterizing those events as riots made it possible for them to do so. I'm afraid I don't think that the sort of stupid, violent, destructive disorders we recently witnessed had any true political purpose or reason within them. You shouldn't offer a political explanation for them. They were basically the sort of people who any sensible person dreads having as neighbours, misbehaving because they thought they'd get away with it. A much better example was it 2011, the great disorders in London when the police just seemed to have lost control and people were out looting in large parts of the city. There was no conceivable political explanation for, justification for, or indeed conclusion to be drawn from those events, except that if the police aren't there, then people will behave worse than if they are. But they are also called riots, but they weren't riots. I mean, if they were largely looting operations.
What do you think is the political agenda of those people using the word riots?
I have one. They probably couldn't spell either word. I don't think it's. I think it's absurd looking at these pathetic figures charging the police with wheelie bins and then falling flat on their faces, and the rest of them giving them the dignity of political actors is both foolish and misguided.
I suppose,
and lazy, because it's not. It involves a complete absence of thought. They aren't. I mean, there have been in the history of the world times when I think, particularly in France, you would get large numbers of people actually going on the streets for a unified political purpose. But this is nothing like that.
I suppose those people calling them riots, though, are the political class and the media. What do you think that if they weren't riots, what do you think the political agenda of those people calling them are? Because I don't even necessarily think it would be those people.
But most people don't think most of the time. You get used to that.
On the topic then of people agitating, whether it's politically motivated or not, it has become popular to say we live in the age of an omni-cause. People are pushing whatever it is that they're interested in, or they're agitating against institutions or the establishment. And I see constant demands for social justice within the corporate world, and many leaders end up caving into those demands somehow and work those into strategies. And perhaps that's part of status preservation. Perhaps it's out of compassion. What would you say about leaders who tend to accede to those demands from activists, where revolutionary activity, even at a small scale, seems to be almost treated and engaged in as a sport and something to keep you occupied these days?
But these things are the opium of the people. I mean, to paraphrase and reverse Karl Marx, in the absence of the Christian religion, people need something to provide the heart of a heartless world and the soul of soulless conditions. They long to believe that a better world can come into existence, and I can only sympathize with that. I just happen to know that they're mistaken in thinking that the things which they campaign for will bring that about. But it's once the idea of eternal justice has faded from the national mind, then the idea of what you refer to as social justice, which I think is probably an oxymoron, is a popular replacement in people's minds, and it's a good impulse, but it chases along futile and dangerous and often destructive channels which don't achieve what it seeks to achieve, in my view. But I can quite understand why people adopt causes. The same thing goes for the Green movement. It has almost all the characteristics of religion.
Religiosity, that was once at the heart of England, of Britain. Can England ever be England without its long history of religiosity as the country becomes?
Isn't religiosity a pejorative word? I don't know. Perhaps so. Not for me to say what the future may bring, but I think that so much of the society of civilization which we have, which we had achieved by 1914, was dependent upon the Christian religion, and indeed of widespread knowledge and acceptance of it in the public mind. That once those things go, then the civilization can't be sustained. It's interesting looking at the buildings, the great buildings of justice in London, both the law courts in the Strand and the Old Bailey. You'll find they're full of Christian imagery. The same goes also for the Houses of Parliament. Most people don't realize, for instance, that the chimes of Big Ben are based upon the air in Handel's Messiah. I know that my Redeemer liveth. The whole Gothic structure of the building, and the murals of saints and all the rest of it is, and the fact that it is at the bottom of it, there is still a chapel beneath St. Stephen's. It emphasizes the Christian nature of our national foundation, which I suppose you could say in some ways goes back to King Alfred. And if that is gone, then what is our society founded upon exactly? What is it that we believe is what is our measure of right and wrong? Without that, we don't have one, in my view. And what is the source of authority? By what power do our leaders rule? Well, they say they rule by the authority of the ballot box, but the polls get lower and lower. The parties become less and less representative and weaker. The elections are more and more lifeless and dishonest, with less and less of what the future government is going to do actually even discussed. How much legitimacy do they actually have, and can the ballot box continue to provide it? And if people cease to believe in the legitimacy of the ballot box, where do they turn instead?
point you made about what we cohere our culture around, what used to be widespread acceptance of the Christian story being at the heart of our civilization, I suppose it's fair to say that we've been living under an attempt to institute multiculturalism, and people who complain about multiculturalism not being very good can often be told to be retrograde, that they're trying to protect something for their own interests. But what I've noticed that is quite interesting in the social commentary of more prominent British ethnic minorities like Rakib Ehsan, for example, who is a social cohesion researcher. He's Muslim, and he said that he would much prefer to live in a Britain that championed its Christian heritage than one that tried to be all things to all people. And that would be something he could get around.
I speak to Muslims from time to time who say the same thing. They would rather this was a more Christian country than it is, than a less Christian country. And that is the case, and I quite understand that. I mean, I have lots of disagreements with Islam, but I find also that it's more possible often to discuss the more profound things in life with faithful, serious Muslims than it is with secularists, because they have considered the great, deep subjects of how the world is and what its purpose is, that are generally left unconsidered in a secular, selfish world. But the less Christianity there is, I think the less welcoming the environment is for members of other religions as well.
Well, staying on Christianity, and I might have got the link all wrong here, but a few years ago I saw an interview with you, and you said, this is paraphrasing, and I know you'll put me right if I get it wrong, but
I will.
You said that there was nothing good in this temporal world. What did you mean by that?
Well, I kind of said nothing good. I said you'd have to point me to the actual passage. What I do think is that there's no temporal hope, because there isn't.
What do you?
My hope is entirely in eternity. There's nothing to hope for in the temporal world. It will let you down. It's full of despair. And without the eternal, then we're lost. Everybody knows who has any experience of it, for instance, that there is no justice, even in societies which claim to have advanced and civilized judicial systems and proper courts and all the rest of it. Justice is incredibly elusive in actual human life. And yet we have within us, in my view, along with conscience, such a ferocious desire for justice that I will always say it's one of the main reasons for believing in the eternal and in God, is that if you want justice, you're not going to find it in the temporal world. You're only going to find it in the eternal. Therefore, there must be eternity for there to be justice. But there are lots of good. There's a lot of good done in the temporal world. There are good things to be done, good things to be seen and experienced. But that's not quite the same as saying there is hope. And the novels of Dickens are in many cases almost astoundingly superb. But then Dickens's own personal life was so appalling that you have to wonder how a man who treated his own wife so badly could have written so beautifully, and yet it is so.
Yes, this seems to be, I don't know how much of a common theme it is, but when you get into the biographies of great writers or artists like Caravaggio or writers like Dostoevsky, that you find there are skeletons in their closet, and I suppose some people look back at them and say it's because of the depths to which they've gone that they're able to understand human nature and look it unblinkingly in the eye. I
don't think any of us would want our biographies written by somebody else after we were dead. I mean, it doesn't tend to work out well. Very few of us have lived lives of blameless beauty. And
no, none.
I say very few out of caution. I think the word none might be better.
Oh, well, this is true. Yes, I know. But I mean us solely human persons.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so but that was what I meant. And if you can find the quotation of what I actually said, I might be able to explain it better. But that's what I meant.
Okay. Peter, we started quite late, and I don't want to abuse your time anymore because you've been very patient. I would like to ask you what the most consequential thing you've changed your mind on during the course of your life, and how that came to pass suddenly, gradually.
Not for me to say, really. How do we know the consequences of our own actions or judge them? The absolutely central axis of all my change of mind since I abandoned revolutionary socialism has to be Christian belief, because without it, I have no other means of understanding the world, nor any other source of hope or guidance. So I suppose it would necessarily be that. The old C.S. Lewis remarked that he believes in Christianity as he believes in the sun rising, not just because he sees it doing so, but because the whole of the rest of the world is illuminated by it as well.
Your work, I think, as you've talked about, has focused on particular points on which we've lost something, whether it's Britain, whether it's liberty. Are you working on anything else that we can expect to see from you?
I'm hoping to, yes. If I can find a publisher, which is every time I write a book, it's a struggle to actually get anybody to publish it. But currently, I want to write about the great tragedy in which Western civilization and all the rest of the world followed, decided that the privately owned motor car was the best way of transporting people about. If people see as normal and therefore inevitable, but in fact, it wasn't inevitable, and we could have done otherwise. And it's been a tremendous source of ugliness, danger, and misery in human civilization, and waste, which we could have avoided. Working title: The Madness of Cars.
Okay. Well, I have come to agree with that. I find it particularly soul-destroying, and having seen some of the things that have been smashed up to make way for roads,
it's made the world so much uglier than it was before.
Yeah. My grandfathers were archaeologists on the Hadrian's Wall, and I grew up in Hexham, close by. And to make way for a new dual carriageway, they ended up bulldozing through some Roman baths with some of the best preserved mosaics that were still there, amongst other things. But that was one of them, and
it could have been even worse. John Betjeman once wrote a television play called "Pity About the Abbey," which was about a plan to demolish Westminster Abbey to make way for an urban motorway, which in the 1960s, when it was screened, was perfectly thinkable. I tell you. It's amazing what we have destroyed for the great god car.
Yeah, I agree. Peter, where can people find you? I suppose most people watching or listening to this will already know where to find you because you're very well known. But where do you reside on the dark corners of the internet?
One of the bizarre things about minor celebrity is that you can't use your own name on an awful lot of social media because someone else has already bagged it.
So does that explain your Twitter handle being
my Twitter handle
Micah?
is completely baffling, but because not merely is it not my own name, it's not even anybody else's. It's somebody else's name backwards. It's Micah. It's Clarke with the Clarke, Micah, Michah. Now, Micah is, of course, the name of the great prophet who gave the great instruction, "What doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with thy God." But Micah Clarke, which is my Twitter handle backwards, is the name of one of Conan Doyle's great historical novels about the Battle of Sedgemoor, which is one of my favorite books. But if you want to find me on Twitter, Clarke Micah is the way to do it. And if you're baffled by this, there is genuinely on the internet a blog posting called Peter Hitchens FAQs, which both tells you where to find me and explains all these oddities.
Okay, and did you write that yourself, or did a fan write that?
Yes, I didn't think it would be a good idea to wait for somebody else to. Could have been all night.
Okay, Peter. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for putting me right where I frequently went wrong, and thank you for.
Well, I warned you.
No, I mean this is why I got you on. I knew it would be an interesting conversation. It would avail me of any delusions and ignorance, which I knew I would venture. Good luck. I personally think you are beginning to win some friends. I know you have said at the beginning that you hadn't done, but I've noticed you popping up on things like Unheard and other places, and I feel as though there is a wind of change, particularly amongst those who would have previously dismissed anyone who was coming along saying things aren't good, where people are pointing on the internet going, he's bloody right again, isn't he?
Yeah, but the thing is, during this period, I've also been almost completely excluded from the BBC, to which I used to have quite a lot of access. So there's a whole world of access to people's minds which is closed to me because I am unacceptable. Why? Well, you'll have to work it out for yourself. Nobody sends you a letter telling you. You just find that the gigs disappear. The things you used to be invited onto, you're not invited onto anymore, and that's it basically. Nothing you can do about it. There's no one you can appeal to. It just happens, and when it happens, you realize there is something going on. I don't doubt it for a moment.
Okay, well, in that case, here's to the growth of Unheard and other new media, and have you keep out there. But thank you very much, Peter. Take good care, and hopefully next time we'll be able to get a camera working, or we'll do it in person.
Yeah, that'd be better, but it won't necessarily be any great advantage for anybody else. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Peter. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @ThinkingClass and follow me on X @ThinkingClasses. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.